The winter of '84 didn't just freeze rivers. It snapped pine trees in half and buried men standing. Sadie was hours away from freezing to death in the snowpack, and Boone was just a man with a cabin. When she asked where she would sleep, his answer stripped away everything she knew. The cold didn't burn anymore. That was the first sign she was dying. Sadie sat against the splintered wheel of the freight wagon, her knees pulled to her chest, wrapped in a buffalo robe that felt as thin as parchment. The mules were already dead, stiff mounds of frost a dozen yards down the trail. The guide who had sworn he knew a shortcut through the Bitterroot Mountains had taken the only horse that could still walk 2 days ago. He told her he was going for help. Sadie was cynical, but she wasn't a fool. She knew he wasn't coming back. She blinked. Her eyelashes were heavy with ice, sealing together with every slow drag of her eyelids. The sky above the pass was a bruised, heavy purple, promising more snow. She couldn't feel her boots. She couldn't feel her fingers inside her woolen mittens. The panic that had kept her awake for 48 hours had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a terrifying, seductive exhaustion. Sleep was a warm, heavy blanket. All she had to do was close her eyes. A sound broke the wind's low howl. It wasn't a wolf. It was a mechanical, rhythmic crunch, snow compressing under heavy weight. Sadie forced her eyes open, the ice on her lashes tearing at her skin. A shape emerged from the whiteout. At first, she thought it was a bear, a massive, dark silhouette trudging through the drifts. Then, the shape resolved into a man leading a pack horse. He didn't rush toward her. There was no cinematic sprint, no shouting over the wind. He simply adjusted his course, his long legs cutting through thigh-deep snow with steady, agonizing exertion. When he finally stood over her, Sadie craned her neck to look up. He was entirely wrapped in furs and waxed canvas, a heavy rifle slung across his back. His beard was thick and dusted with frost, his face weathered like a piece of old saddle leather. His eyes, peering out from beneath the brim of a slouched hat, were pale and calm. He didn't look shocked to find a woman freezing to death beside a broken wagon. Up here, death was just part of the scenery. "You the only one left?" he asked. His voice was a low gravel rumble, stripped of any inflection. Sadie opened her mouth. Her lips cracked, tasting of copper. "Yes," he nodded once. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what happened. He stepped forward, unlooped a coil of rope from his saddle horn, and pulled a heavy wool blanket from his pack. "Can you stand?" Sadie tried to send the command to her legs. Nothing happened. She shook her head. "All right." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't gently lift her. He grabbed her by the thick collar of her coat and hoisted her up with a singular, brutal tug. Sadie gasped as the sudden movement sent a sickening rush of blood to her frozen extremities. He tossed the wool blanket over her shoulders, practically carrying her to the pack horse. He hoisted her up into the saddle, her dead legs hanging limply against the horse's warm flanks. "Hold the horn," he instructed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Don't fall off. I won't stop to pick you up again." It was a harsh thing to say, but Sadie appreciated the honesty. She clamped her frozen mittens over the saddle horn, burying her face into the horse's coarse mane. The man turned and began walking again, breaking the trail. The journey was a blur of swaying motion, biting wind, and the relentless squeak of snow under boots. Sadie slipped in and out of consciousness. She didn't know if they traveled for an hour or a day. She only knew they stopped when the wind suddenly died, blocked by a heavy stand of ancient Douglas firs. A cabin sat nestled against a rock wall, half buried in the snow. It wasn't picturesque. It was a fortress of raw, unpeeled logs and a heavy sod roof. The man pulled her down from the horse. Her legs collapsed instantly, and he caught her, throwing one of her arms over his shoulder. He kicked the heavy plank door open and dragged her inside. The heat hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just warm, it was stifling. The air smelled intensely of wood smoke, rendered animal fat, and old leather. He deposited her unceremoniously onto a wooden chair near a massive stone hearth, where a bed of coals still glowed red. Without a word to her, he went back outside. The door shut. Sadie sat paralyzed, her body screaming as the ambient heat began to thaw her frozen tissues. It was agonizing. Needles of fire pricked her toes and fingers. She wanted to cry out, but her jaw was locked tight. 10 minutes later, he returned, bringing a stack of split wood. He kicked the door shut, barred it with a heavy timber, and dumped the wood by the hearth. He fed the fire methodically, watching the flames catch before standing up and finally looking at her. He walked over and began untying her boots. "I can do it," Sadie croaked, her voice sounding like dry leaves. "Your hands are useless," he stated. He didn't look up. He yanked the frozen leather boots off her feet. He peeled away the damp wool socks. Sadie braced herself for the sight of black, necrotic flesh. He inspected her toes in the firelight. "Red and swollen, no black. You keep the toes." He dropped her feet and stood up. "Take off the coat, hang it by the fire. You sweatin' that? You'll catch a chill, and then you'll die in my chair." Sadie fumbled with the wooden toggles of her coat with clumsy, throbbing fingers. She managed to shrug it off, revealing the dirt-stained canvas dress underneath. She felt acutely vulnerable. Back in the mining camps, a man looking at a stranded, desperate woman only meant one thing. She had survived the cold, but she knew the rules of the frontier. Everything had a price. He didn't look at her. He moved to an iron stove in the corner, pouring water from a bucket into a blackened tin pot. "Name's Boone," he said, turning his back to her. "Sadie." He set the pot on the stove. "You're lucky, Sadie. Another hour on that pass, the mountain would have kept you." He didn't say it like a savior. He said it like a man stating the price of flour. And as Sadie sat shivering in the dim orange light, staring at the broad line of his shoulders, she began calculating exactly what this rescue was going to cost her. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of survival, the hiss of damp wood in the fire, the rattling boil of the coffee pot, the scrape of Boone's knife against a whetstone as he sharpened a hunting blade. Sadie watched him from her chair by the hearth. The agonizing pain of the thaw had settled into a dull, throbbing ache. She rubbed her hands together, feeling the blood pulsing painfully against the tips of her fingers. She mapped the cabin with her eyes. It was a single room, brutally practical. A small table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with jarred preserves, ammunition, and salt cures, a heavy iron stove, and in the far corner, a single bed. It was a rough timber frame layered with a thick mattress of pine boughs and topped with a mountain of furs and trade blankets. It was the only soft thing in the entire room. Sadie's stomach tightened. She was 30 years old. She had spent the last decade navigating the rough and tumble boom towns of the West, surviving men who smiled too much and men who didn't smile at all. She knew how the world worked. Men did not do favors. They traded. A ride to safety, a warm fire, a meal. These were debts. And a woman alone, with no money and no means of leaving, only had one currency to pay her ledger. Boone stood up, breaking her grim reverie. He poured a mug of black coffee and carried it over to her, along with a tin plate holding a dense brick of hardtack and a thick slice of fried salt pork. "Eat," he said, holding it out. Sadie took the plate. Their fingers brushed. His hands were calloused, hard as river stones, completely indifferent to the heat of the tin mug. She stared at the food. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but her throat felt entirely closed. "Thank you," she managed to say. Boone grunted, returning to the stove to fill his own plate. He sat at the small wooden table, his back to the wall, facing her and the door. A tactical habit. He ate efficiently, without rushing, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Sadie forced herself to chew the salt pork. It was tough and intensely salty, but as it hit her empty stomach, she felt a primal surge of energy. She chased it with the coffee, bitter, scalding, and strong enough to strip paint. Outside, the wind began to batter the heavy log walls. It sounded like a freight train roaring just beyond the timber door. The temperature in the room was warm, but the psychological weight of the storm outside made the cabin feel incredibly small. Boone finished his meal. He wiped his knife on a rag, sheathed it, and walked over to the single small window. He stared out into the pitch-black night, watching the snow lash against the glass. "Storm setting in deep," he said quietly. "Pass will be blocked for a week, maybe 2. Sadie's breath hitched. 2 weeks, 14 days trapped in a single room with a man she didn't know. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. The exhaustion in her bones begged her to sleep, but the hardened survival instinct in her brain screamed at her to stay awake, to stay vigilant. She watched Boone turn away from the window. He walked to a heavy wooden chest, opened it, and pulled out a clean, thick woolen blanket. He tossed it onto the edge of the bed in the corner. Then he walked to the table and began to unbuckle his heavy gun belt. The clinking of the brass cartridges against the wood was loud in the quiet room. Sadie's hands gripped her tin mug tightly. It was time. It was the moment the bill came due. She had to know. She couldn't endure the anxiety of waiting for him to make his demand. She needed to set the terms, or at least brace for them. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but they held her weight. "Boone," she said. Her voice was louder than she intended, a sharp sound in the intimate space. He paused, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. He looked over at her. "Yeah?" She swallowed hard. She gestured toward the single bed in the corner. "Where do I sleep?" She hated the tremor in her voice. She hated how small she sounded. She braced herself for the smirk, the casual proposition, the implicit threat disguised as an offer to share the warmth. Boone looked at the bed. Then he looked at her. He studied her face, the tight set of her jaw, the defensive posture of her shoulders, the sheer, exhausted terror in her eyes. He saw the ledger she was balancing in her head. He saw the years of transactional survival written in the lines around her mouth. He didn't step toward her. He didn't lower his voice to a patronizing murmur. He leaned against the wooden table, his face deadly serious, his tone completely flat. "You sleep in the bed," Boone said. Sadie blinked, waiting for the rest of the sentence. "With me, for a price." But Boone just pointed a heavy, calloused finger at the stone hearth. "I sleep on the floor by the fire. The door is barred, the rifle stays loaded." He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away. His pale eyes saw right through her armor. "Listen to me, Sadie," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that forced her to stand still. "I know where you've been. I know the kind of camps you walked out of. But you crossed the tree line today. The rules from down there don't climb this high." He picked up a heavy buffalo robe from a chair and threw it onto the floorboards near the hearth. "You ain't a commodity here. You ain't a debt to be collected. You're just a person who survived the snow." He kicked off his boots. "You take the bed. You sleep until you wake up. Nobody touches you. Nobody asks you for a damn thing." Sadie stood frozen by the chair. She had survived freezing temperatures, starvation, and predatory men. She had learned how to fight, how to lie, and how to harden her heart into an iron fist. But as Boone turned his back, wrapped himself in the buffalo robe, and laid down on the hard floorboards, asking for absolutely nothing in return, that was what finally broke her. For the first time in 10 years, she realized she was safe. The iron fist in her chest unclenched. A single hot tear carved a path down her dirt-streaked cheek. She walked over to the bed, crawled beneath the heavy furs, and for the first time in her life, she closed her eyes and simply rested. She woke to the smell of burning pine and old coffee. Sadie didn't open her eyes immediately. For a long, terrifying second, she expected the freezing bite of the wind, the heavy weight of the snowpack, and the metallic taste of her own dying breath. Instead, she felt the heavy warmth of a trade blanket and the coarse ticking of a pine bough mattress. She opened her eyes. The cabin was cast in the slate-gray light of early morning. The storm outside had not broken. If anything, the wind howled with a more desperate pitch, throwing hard sheets of ice against the single glass pane. Boone was already awake. He sat at the small wooden table by the window, a pile of leather straps and a curved wooden frame resting on his lap. He was working an awl through heavy hide, weaving rawhide laces to repair a snowshoe. His movements were rhythmic, economical, and completely silent. Sadie sat up, pulling the thick blanket up to her chin. Her body ached with a deep, bruised soreness. Her toes throbbed, a dull pulse that reminded her she still had them. "There's beans on the stove," Boone said. He didn't look up from the snowshoe. "Coffee's black." Sadie threw her legs over the edge of the bed. Her canvas dress was rumpled and stiff with dried snowmelt.